At the tender age of 16, I left home for the Missouri Ozarks, where I ended up living in a cave. You might be asking yourself what my home life must have been like to make me want to do a thing like that. My home life at that time wasn't really that bad. I just had a strong desire to get out and get close to nature. The story, My Side of the Mountain, was also an influence. My sixth grade teacher used to like to read to us each day. My Side of the Mountain was one of the books she read from. I also had a crush on a girl that used to skip school with me occasionally. Her family had just moved to Sunrise Beach, Missouri, a small town near Lake of the Ozarks. Lake of the Ozarks was kind of rustic in those days, with some light tourist trappings. Not like it is today, wall-to-wall houses, high-rise time-sharing outlets, and hotels. Yuck. I would just like to say this was not the first time I had run away from home. My brother and a neighborhood friend and I left home on a hitchhiking trip to a lake called Lake Jacomo, about 20 miles east of our home. This was 3 years before my cave-dwelling trip. I was 13 years old at the time. Our trip did not go well, and we ended up coming back home later that night. The Ozarks held a special place in my heart because my dad had a friend who owned a small resort with a few cabins called Dee's Crown Point Resort. At least once a summer, we would make a trip to Dee's for a few days of fun and relaxation. Dee had a large boat dock and a few boats with outboards for rent. Squirrel hunting, fishing, and swimming were my favorite pastimes there. Dee sat above the lake on a point, thus the name. Years later, I would visit the real Crown Point on the Columbia River in Washington State. In any case, it was early October when I got the itch to head for the lake. The lake was about 100 miles southeast of Kansas City, Missouri. I was in an organization called Civil Air Patrol at the time. It was an auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force. Members wore Air Force uniforms, and it would prepare young people for service in the U.S. Air Force. It would also be called on to help locate missing small civilian aircraft and in natural disaster relief. Training included aviation history, military discipline, drills, survival training, bivouac, search and rescue, first aid. You could even get your pilot's license in the Civil Air Patrol. More on that in another story. I packed my duffel bag with things I thought I would need. Some old Army blankets, canteen, matches, a warm jacket, and most of my clothes, which consisted of 2 shirts, 2 pairs of pants. I also packed my Remington .22 caliber rifle, which I took apart to make it easier to pack in my duffel bag, along with a box of ammunition. I figured I might have to hunt squirrels or rabbits to stay alive. I dressed in my khaki Civil Air Patrol uniform, thinking I might get rides easier if drivers thought I was in the military. My dad was our guardian, and he had just left for work. I wrote a note stating I was leaving home, and I turned my dad's radio way up so it would wake my brother and sister up after I left. Hopefully, they would then discover my note next to the radio. I got a ride right away. I also took a route that was not the expected route to my destination. I surprisingly got a lot of rides in a short period of time. I had a scare in a small town east of Kansas City, Missouri called Blue Springs when a Missouri highway patrolman stopped to check me out on a ramp leading to Interstate 70. I checked out okay and he let me go. I would have probably been in some trouble had he known about my .22 rifle, however. I got many rides of considerable distance and was soon in Ozark country, south and east of Sedalia, Missouri. My last ride was from a young high school teacher. I could tell she was kind of curious about what I was doing and why. She never said anything, however. After arriving at Sunrise Beach, I went to a local market and bought some cans of stew and soup. I hid my pack in some nearby woods so I would not have to carry it into the store. I also changed into street clothes there so I would not attract attention. I hiked to the road of my so-called crush lived on and found a cut in the woods created by some power lines running through it. It ran north and south. I hid my pack just over a small drop-off on the cut so I could not be seen from the road. I arrived at my crush's house and met her family. Her dad was busy building onto their house. He was building a bedroom over their kitchen, and he was in the framing stage. I found out he was a marine mechanic for a local boat dealership. He seemed to be a pretty nice guy and seemed perplexed at my presence. I met her younger brother, who would prove to be a pretty good friend. My crush, however, was not so much interested in me anymore. I guess I can understand that. I must admit, I was somewhat eccentric. I hiked back to the power line cut and began to set up my camp. It soon got dark and I built a small fire after laying out my bedding. I was living my dream, as it were. A nice fire, millions of stars overhead. This was heaven. As I lay enjoying the sky, I heard about 5 or 6 coonhounds baying to the south of me. I sat up and saw a flashlight scanning the ground about a half a mile away. I smothered my fire with dirt in a panic. The flashlight and the coonhounds soon disappeared. I did not build another fire and stayed alert until I fell fast asleep. The next day, I hiked down to my crush's house. Her dad was at work, as was she. Her mother was home, and she seemed kind of bemused to see me. Her brother and I talked for a while, and we seemed to hit it off. He told me he knew of a cave I could probably stay in if I was interested. Here is a photo I took of it about 46 years after my adventure. In many ways, it was perfect. The view of the lake was fantastic. It had pockets in the wall that I used to store firewood and my gear in. The only drawback was that an old man who lived on top of the bluff, he could not see very well or hear very well, but when I would build a fire in the cave, he could smell the smoke and would throw rocks and logs over the side of the bluff to chase me away. I had to be careful to build my fires after his bedtime. My crush's brother brought many of his friends down to the cave to visit with me. Many of them would steal liquor from their parents' liquor cabinets, and we would make a party of it. One night after one of these parties, my friends had gone home, I awoke to discover I'd rolled over into my campfire, setting the arm of my jacket on fire. I stood up as best I could and tried to beat it out with my hand. I'm sure if anyone had been there to see the whole thing, it would have been painful to watch. I illustrated it as best I could, and after I got the fire out, I was hit with nature's call. This did not go well either. Let's just say I micturated on my jeans. I will not illustrate that. I think you get the picture. After a week of cave life, my crush's brother told me about a job opening at a local sawmill. It was some distance away, however, but I could ride the local school bus to work and walk home, as I did not have to be at my cave on time. The day I went to try to get the job at the sawmill, I remember trying to think of a reason I wasn't in school. I came up with a story about my family moving to the area and not having enough money to make it through the first winter without me working to help make ends meet. The owner of the sawmill was a pretty nice guy. He had dark hair and kind of long and a big bushy beard and mustache. I remember his name was Gene Allison. I was hired on as a hand and made a whopping $1.75 an hour. When I left the job later, the owner confessed he did not really believe my story when he hired me, but hired me because his son had just run away from home a couple of weeks before. He imagined what it could be like for his son and hired me. The ride to work on the school bus was interesting in that all the local kids treated me like a celebrity of sorts. They would crowd around me at the back of the bus and ask me questions about what it was like living in a cave. I soon got the nickname of Daniel Boone. The school district was small and not well funded. They only had a limited amount of buses, and the buses carried high school, junior high, and grade school all together. Unfortunately for me, the Sawmill was just down the road from the grade school. I looked kind of slow at age 16 getting off at the grade school. Hey, it was a ride to work. If I needed a bath, I would get up early and hike down to the lake just before the sun would come up. Some mornings it was pretty cold, as this was October. Some of the local school kids would take me on rides around the area in their cars so they could say they were friends with Daniel Boone. One guy had a convertible, and he had a habit of pulling up to stop signs very slowly and placing his front bumper on the wooden post and pushing them over. I didn't agree with this, but I said nothing. Another kid took me to his parents' house, which was an old Ozark original. The rooms were covered walls to ceiling in beaded board. The job at the Sawmill was not easy, but it was interesting. At least to me it was. Gene, the Sawmill's owner, had an old military surplus high loader that had a hinge in the center of the body to make it more maneuverable. The loader was equipped with a four-fingered claw on the front so it could pick up logs. The mill was equipped with an early 1950s Chevy flatbed truck. The mill was making oak pallets out of rough, uncured oak. One of my jobs at the mill was to pull errant or crooked nails fired from the nail gun and replace them with hand-hammered nails. Not an easy task in the uncured oak slabs. I went through a lot of nails in the process. Another of my jobs was shoveling sawdust away from the saw table area. I was also used to remove the bark-covered outer slabs from the cutting table and pile them next to the giant sawdust pile. I also helped to load the flatbed with pallets on shipping day. The rough-cut, uncured wet pallets weighed anywhere from 60 to 70 pounds. There were 3 other guys who worked at the mill besides the owner, and only one of them really stood out to me. The guy was nicknamed Crazy George because he had an odd habit of letting out a loud whoop for no apparent reason. George had just returned from Vietnam and was thought to have suffered some kind of a mental trauma. George wore a Vietnam-issue Army green slouch hat and an Army green BDU or basic dress uniform shirt. Everybody who worked there had a nickname. Mine was Jeter Stud. I like the stud part of it. It kind of fits. I can remember Crazy George calling down to me from the bed of the flatbed stacked high with pallets. "Hey there, Jeter Stud. Throw me up here that there cheater bar, will ya?" And we would go to a local bar and restaurant for lunch, and my coworkers all wore bib overalls except for George. They had no shirts on and no underwear on. They were quite a sight. By this time, my crush's family had gotten used to having me around. Occasionally, I would get invited to dinner or be allowed to watch TV with the family. I was still living in the cave, however. One night, I was watching TV with the family and a bad storm blew in. It was time for me to head to my cave. I had no flashlight, and there was a particularly bad spot on the trail, high up on the bluff. A ravine about 7 or 8 feet wide broke the trail. about 100 feet in. The complete trail was about 1,500 yards long. I could only see when lightning would light up the trail. I got to the trail and rain was pouring down heavily. I was soaked. I knew I was probably not going to make it across the ravine. Rain was pouring down it in a rush. I thought I might be able to grab some buckbrush growing on the other side if I slipped and fell. I jumped and slid down the ravine toward the lake. The ravine was about 150 feet long. As I slid toward the lake in terror, I was sure I was going to be injured. Fortunately, a tree had fallen across the ravine and stopped my slide. The water rolled over me when I stopped sliding. I pulled myself out of the ravine by holding on to buckbrush, using lightning flashes as a flashlight. No pun intended. And when I finally got back to my cave, I was exhausted and soaked. I built a small fire to dry out by. I knew the old man would not be out on a night like that. After 3 or 4 weeks, the word had gotten around about me in the community. My co-workers were beginning to ask me questions about where I lived. One day, we had to knock off early because of heavy rain. My co-workers offered to give me a ride home. I told them my crush's house was where I lived. They pulled up in front of the house but did not drive off. They were watching to see if I got into the house. No one was home. I checked the door and no luck. I pretended to check my pockets for my key. No luck. I then waved at them and walked around to the back of the house as if I had a key hidden by the back door. Fortunately, they drove away. I quickly headed for my cave. My crush's brother and a buddy of his asked me if I would like to take a boat ride down to Bagnell Dam later that evening. They left out some important details, however. The first of which was that he was going to steal a boat for the trip. He was also going to steal life jackets, boat cushions, and whatever else we needed for the trip. The boat was a 1969 Glastron with a walk-through or door windshield. Our first stop was a popular resort called Lodge of the Four Seasons. In those days, it was the premier resort on the lake. My crush's brother planned on getting us some beer, which was difficult since we were underage. He had enough cash on him to get us 2 12-packs. We pulled up to the dock, and he hopped out and went to work. He immediately spotted a guy in his late 50s who looked like he had way too much to drink. He told the guy he would give him some of our beer if he would buy some for us. The plan went well. The guy bought us 2 12-packs. My crush's brother, however, decided he was not going to give our benefactor any of the beer. He began to raise a stink, which attracted the attention of people outside the resort's lodge. My crush's brother changed his mind and decided to throw him a couple of beers. By this time, we were about 20 feet from the dock. The beers flew through the air in a great arc and bounced off the corner of the dock. Our benefactor nearly fell into the lake trying to catch them. Much to his dismay, he lost his beers. We sped off in the night. I must confess that I do not remember much about the trip to Bagnell Dam. Streaks of light passing by seemed to be my only recollection. When we reached the dam area, I remember seeing a double-deck party boat with the sound of a rock band echoing from its decks, with the silhouettes of people dancing in a dull yellow light. The dam area in those days was kind of a giant carnival spread out along a 1-mile strip leading to the dam on its west side, loud and well lighted all the way. After an hour or two of staggering around in the crowds, we decided to call it a night and head for home. The ride home was much like the ride down to the dam, a blur. I remember getting out on the dock and flopping down on it on my back. I remember the stars spinning in a circle above me. leaving long trails of light behind them as they spun. I don't remember how I got back to my cave, but I did. My crush's father, as I said, was a pretty nice guy. One day he invited me to take a boat ride with him on a speedboat he was working on. Speedboat would be putting it mildly. The boat was very short and flat to the water and had a fairly large outboard on the back. He fired it up and we accelerated across the water. It was hard to see what was going on as the wind was making it hard to open my eyes. We seemed to be airborne for most of the trip, bouncing from wave top to wave top. The boat would hit each wave top like a hammer, which would compress my spine in an uncomfortable jolt. The shoreline would approach at an alarming speed. It was uncomfortable, to say the least. I have to admit, it was a new experience, to say the least. One I have never repeated. It was now late November and the weather was beginning to feel wintry. My lake baths were getting uncomfortable. The fun was wearing off, as it were. I decided I was going to head back home. My crush's family arranged for me to get a ride home. I left my .22 rifle with them, as they said they would arrange to send it to some friends who lived near my home. I could pick it up there. I went back home and got back into the routine. I guess the news of my disappearance got around the school, and I became a kind of minor celebrity there. I was pretty well known for having an interest in art at the school. 2 years later, in my junior year in high school, a small art show of students' work was posted in the main hallway of the school. I had a painting of the sawmill I worked at done from memory. One of the students approached me and said, "That looks like my dad's sawmill." I asked, "What is your dad's name?" He replied, "Gene Allison." I said, "That is your dad's sawmill." I then told him about working for his dad. His dad offered to buy it from me, but I ended up giving it to him as a gift. Of course, that story got around the school as well. This is a postscript of sorts. Some of the photos used in this video I took when I was about 63 years old. My wife and I were invited to use the lake house of an old friend from high school. It was somewhat close to my old cave. I decided to try to revisit it again. I had some difficulty in finding it, however, and after a couple hours I was successful. I knocked on some doors in the area and met the blonde-haired lady in the center of this photo. She in turn introduced me to the man and woman on the left and right of her. The woman on the right with the red top on, as I remember as being one of my old crush's friends at the time of my caveman adventure. I decided to try to use the old trail to get to my cave. That proved to be a lot more difficult than I imagined. It had grown up over the years and was like a jungle. I was a little older too. Little is, of course, an understatement. I finally reached my cave. It was really strange being there after almost half a century. My wife and these folks became concerned for my welfare and began calling for me, thinking I might have had a heart attack. And my old crush's house was gone now, and her friend confided in me that she thought she was kind of weird. I wondered to myself what that made me. Well, anyway, I hope you enjoyed my story, and if you would, please hit the like or subscribe button and tell your friends about my site. Thank you for watching.